Hello and welcome to Real Obscure. My name is Kevin H. Shaw, and tonight I'll be summoning up a forgotten Fright Fest from 1982, or 1984, or possibly 1985. Why all this confusion over the release date? Well, keep listening as we take a look at 1980-something's Superstition. Or is it The Witch? Or maybe even Superstition, The Witch? I am so confused. So let's start with what we do know. The movie in question is a Canadian production and was filmed in the US in 1981 as The Witch. The director, James Robeson, was a relative newcomer to directing. Although to this day he still only has a handful of directorial credits to his name, he's an established and very successful cinematographer. His credits include The Town That Dreaded Sundown and Encounter with the Unknown, plus a ton of TV work, including The Fall Guy, Melissa and Joey, and a number of live-action Disney TV shows. Now, the movie came about when Robeson partnered with some friends, Brad White, Michael Osage-Bell, and Brett Thompson-Plate, to work on a script for a movie. As they were all relatively recent graduates of film school and were struggling to find work as hands-on filmmakers, they chose instead to try their hand at scriptwriting as a way to get their foot in the door. Wow, you want to talk about mixed metaphors? Hands and feet everywhere there. Anyway, as is often the way with these things, a friend of a friend was able to set up a meeting to pitch their ideas to the producers, Mario Kassar and Andrew Vajna. If those names are familiar to you, it's because they went on to become a production powerhouse, overseeing such titles as the Rambo series, the Terminator franchise, Jacob's Ladder, Total Recall, and Basic Instinct. In 1980 they produced the highly successful Chiller, The Changeling, and so presumably were in the market for another ghostly production. It seemed The Witch had that special something that they were looking for, at least in part. As Robeson recalls, Kassar and Vajna loved the idea of the movie, but if it was to move forward, they had one stipulation. The script would have to undergo rewrites at the hands of Donald G. Thompson. Realizing it was better to get something of their story on the screen than nothing at all, the writers agreed, and so production began under the oversight of Ed Carlin. Superstition stars James Houghton as David. Houghton was the son of Buck Houghton, a writer and producer on a string of TV shows and movies with credits including The Wraith and The Escape Artist. But he's probably most famous to genre fans as the producer of The Twilight Zone. James Houghton had an extensive career in television, particularly in soap operas, including The Young and the Restless and Knots Landing. He worked both as an actor and a TV scriptwriter. Superstition was filmed between seasons of Knots Landing, and there's an interview on the Shout Factory Blu-ray where he tells a story of how his hair had been turning grey and so he decided to dye it. Unfortunately, the process accidentally left him with bright orange hair. He'd initially planned just to sit it out and wait for it to grow back, but then he was offered this role. And so the hair department on the movie came up with a great solution. Boot polish. Yeah, it didn't really work very well, and if you look closely, you can see his hair is a very, very odd colour, particularly if you're watching in HDR. His co-star, Albert Salmi, was an established character actor, known for playing detectives or military men on both TV and the big screen. He's another one of those actors you'll immediately recognise, and as genre fans you'll probably know him from his role in the Twilight Zone episode The Quality of Mercy. Stacy Keach Sr. began his television career with guest spots in westerns such as Maverick and The Lone Ranger, and he also appeared in Get Smart and Marcus Welby MD. who's also the father of Stacy Keach, of Mike Hammer fame. The cast also includes Larry Pennell as George Leahy, Lynn Carlin as Melinda Leahy, and Heidi Bohe, Melo McCaslin, and Billie Jane as their children Anne, Cheryl, and Justin. So what's it all about? Well, the movie opens on a young couple, Nancy, played by Nova Ball, and Danny, played by Michael Cornelison, who are making out in Danny's car, parked at a known parking spot beside an abandoned old house. Nancy becomes increasingly scared, referencing the house's reputation as being haunted and the site of numerous unexplained deaths. Danny, however, being a horny teenager, isn't really interested in what she has to say. However, before things can go any further, a ghoulish apparition leaps from one of the windows, causing the couple to flee. Now, before you judge this movie's awful ghost effects too harshly, note that this whole setup is actually a prank being played by two teenagers called Charlie and Artie, who are played by Johnny Duran and Bennett Liss. They've rigged up a Halloween dummy to scare parking kids. Now, this section was actually written by Robeson and is based on a prank that he actually pulled as a child. So Artie goes in search of Charlie, but begins to become unsettled by unexplained noises and movements. It's a sequence that's wonderfully atmospheric, shot with a stalking camera, shadowy lighting, and a great sinister soundtrack. As the door slams itself shut, Artie makes his way instead to the kitchen. He watches bemused and then horrified as a microwave oven switches itself on and the door swings open. He is then thrown from floor to ceiling by an unknown force, which knocks him unconscious. Charlie, who was outside the whole time, enters the house looking for his friend and, much like Artie's experience, he becomes disturbed by the atmosphere of the house as something unseen follows him from room to room. As he enters the kitchen, he sees the microwave, only now it's occupied by the head of his friend. He watches in terror as the head explodes and the door flies open. Charlie flees, attempting to escape through a half-opened window. But as he does so, the window slams shut, pinning him in place as an unseen entity within slashes him with a knife, eventually cutting him in two. As his legs fall twitching to the floor, his torso slams to the dirt outside, shuddering and shaking as Charlie dies. Now, this sequence may be here purely as an attention grabber, but it does a great job setting the tone for the movie. Unlike other haunted house movies, this is much more of a supernatural slasher than it is a paranormal chiller. Whatever horror haunts the house is very much a corporeal entity, capable of inflicting bodily harm on whomever it encounters. As we mentioned, Robeson was an accomplished cinematographer, and he did a lot of the camera operation on the movie himself as well. And you can really tell he's one of those directors with an eye for framing and shot composition, and the whole sequence here is just incredibly effective. Now at this point we meet our lead, David, who is played by James Houghton. He's a clergyman who's recently been assigned to take over the day-to-day operations of the church as the former minister, Reverend Meyer, played by Stacy Keach Sr., is retiring. It's at this point we're also introduced to Inspector Sturgis, played by Albert Salmi, and his partner Hollister, Casey King. Sturgis discusses the old house, voicing his annoyance that the property, which is owned by the church, is the site of numerous unexplained deaths and drownings, which he believes may be related to the occult, and that the church needs to do more to ensure that these events cease. Something I like about this introduction for these characters is that actually they don't like each other when they first meet. Sturgis is dismissive of the new guy, calling him Sonny, and David just doesn't like being spoken to in this way. This isn't really a character-driven movie, but the two do become unlikely allies later on, and it's nice to see at least there's some kind of setup of them having a character arc. And so Reverend Meyer, David, and the two detectives go to visit the house, which is currently being renovated for the arrival of the new minister, Reverend George Leahy, who's played by Larry Pennell, and his family, who are going to be moving in a few weeks. Now, filming actually took place in a real location. It's a real house in California called the Garbett House, which was built in 1928 by industrialist Frank A. Garbett, who constructed the entire house from concrete in an effort to proof it against fire and earthquakes. Now, this house is wonderfully creepy and makes for a great cinematic playground for Robeson. There's a real claustrophobic feel to a lot of it, and he does some wonderful framing with some strange angles, just capturing this weird internal geometry of the place. Anyway, back to the story. So the clergyman and the detectives meet the mute Arlen, Joshua Cadman, and his mother, Elvira Sharak, who is played by Jacqueline Hyde. Jacqueline Hyde. Jacqueline? Is that a joke? Jacqueline Hyde? I don't know. That's funny. So they meet with Elvira Sharak, played by Jacqueline Hyde, who both live in a small bungalow on the property under the terms of the house being bequeathed to the church, and they act as unofficial caretakers. Sturgis suspects Arlen's involvement in the recent murders, and when David and the inspector encounter him in the house, he flees. Hollister follows him to the lake behind the house and sees Arlen leaning into the water as if he's communing with something in there. After Arlen disappears into the woods, he goes to investigate, only to find nothing. But then, in a great bait and switch, he stoops to pick up some dropped coins and is dragged into the depths of the waters. Sometime later, Sturgis, assuming Arlen fought with Hollister and threw him into the water, detains him in custody. But when Arlen hears of plans to drain the lake, he breaks free and vanishes into the woods. David and Sturgis speak with his mother, Elvira, but all she will say is, like his father before him, he serves his mistress, and that he is lost to her. Now, there are a number of scenes like this where David in particular goes to talk to Elvira, and it looks as if they were added later, after principal photography had finished. I'm really not sure, but it just seems as if these scenes are big exposition drops, maybe for changes that they made as they were filming, and they had to come up with a way to convey this information to the audience. It works the first time, but by the time you get to the second one, it kind of seems as if it's really dragging the film down a little bit. It's one of the few criticisms I do have of the script and its pacing. It's almost as if the movie pauses to tell you what's happening. But back to the plot. So we cut to David a couple of weeks later, and he's completing renovations on the house ahead of the Leahy family's arrival. He encounters a young girl who introduces herself as Mary and says that she's come to visit the house. Maya then calls David into the living room and expresses his desire to bless the house. But, as he calls for silence, a circular saw blade being used by one of the church workers comes loose from the saw and bounces, spinning across the room and burying itself in Maya's chest and killing him. Now, there's a definite Euro horror influence on this movie, with some of these scenes feeling as if they'd be right at home in one of Fulci's Gates of Hell movies. Now, what I appreciate is the timing of this scene, as it's very well balanced. It's long enough to sell the horror, but doesn't linger so long as to make everybody watching just look ridiculous for standing there doing nothing. As much as I like some of Fulci's work, he does sometimes have a tendency to play his scenes like this just a little too long for my tastes. It becomes a little bit ridiculous when everybody is just standing watching and screaming and not doing anything. Anyway, back to the plot. So it's the day of the Leahy family's arrival at their new house. George and his wife Melinda and their children Anne, Cheryl and Justin are all hugely excited to move in. But they soon realise that there is something very, very wrong in their new home. And I think that's about enough of a synopsis for now, because I don't want to spoil the remainder of the plot. Suffice to say, we discover through a flashback that a 17th century witch named Alondra Sharak was put on trial by Father Pike and found guilty of murdering a young girl. But unable to bring himself to burn her, Pike instead imprisons her in the lake using a sacred crucifix to bind her there. However, before she is committed to the water, she places a curse upon all those present and anybody who lives on the land. And so the movie then plays out very much in the style of a 1980s slasher, with Alondra the witch stalking all who enter the house and slaying them in a variety of ways. That may sound like the usual 80s schlock, but the thing is, it actually works very well. We see very little of the witch during these attacks, other than her shadow and her taloned, almost reptilian claws, and when she finally is revealed, it's only as a silhouette of her in a hooded robe, backlit and accompanied by howling winds. As James Houghton recounted, Robeson's decision to keep the witch's appearance so ambiguous worked in the movie's favour, as it really allowed the audience to project whatever they wanted onto it. I certainly agree, it's a very effective technique, and the shots of the witch are genuinely creepy and very impressive. The witch in these scenes is actually played by stunt coordinator Bud Davis, a performer with a hugely impressive resume, including playing the killer in The Town That Dreaded Sundown. Davis also worked right into his 60s, with his movie credits including Forrest Gump, Tango and Cash, Castaway, and the criminally underrated Manhunter. If you haven't seen it, go do so now, if only to see Brian Cox's vastly superior performance as Hannibal Lecter. Filming was completed in 1981, and although the cast were shown a cut of the film at the time, after that it just vanished. Aside from a very limited run in New York and a few other East Coast locations, the movie did not gain a proper US release. There is some speculation that Kassar and Vajna, who just completed production on First Blood, felt John Rambo's inaugural outing was going to be their real breakout movie, and so shelved The Witch so as not to compete with themselves. How true this is, I don't know, but for whatever reason the movie was put on ice until its release on VHS in 1985 under the new title Superstition. However, in the UK the movie, released as The Witch, was a huge hit on VHS in the early 80s, and that's how I first encountered it, although I believe it was actually titled Superstition, The Witch. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but that's certainly how I recall it being referenced by everybody who had seen it. Anyway, the movie was so successful that it actually got a subsequent theatrical release in 1985 in the UK, which is unheard of. But it wasn't all plain sailing for The Witch in the UK, as it did run into trouble with the whole Video Nasties fiasco. Although not on the main list of banned movies, it was considered a Section 3 film, meaning police could seize and destroy copies of the movie, although no charges will be brought against anybody possessing or distributing it. The movie was in good company though, as the focus of our first episode, Nightmare City, was also a Section 3 title. But The Witch was later passed uncut for its cinematic release and the 1986 VHS reissue. Now, on a side note, I was watching the Shout Factory Blu-ray, and it features two great interviews, one with James Houghton, who sadly passed away this year, and another with James Robeson. Houghton is a great raconteur, sharing stories of his youth and his father's productions, his time on the movie, and his views on filmmaking and acting in general. Robeson, meanwhile, provides some great background on his career and the production of Superstition, and both are well worth the time to give a watch. As for the movie itself, well, if you're a fan of slasher movies, then you're gonna have a good time here. The way it's shot and structured is very reminiscent of the original Friday the 13th, and although there's no question to the killer's identity, it's still filmed in such a way as to preserve the witch's air of mystery. And as I mentioned before, there's a definite Euro-horror influence on this movie, so if you enjoy the works of Fulci or Argento, then you're going to find a lot to enjoy here too, from the elaborate style of some of the kills to the music score. When it's not a refrain from Deus Irae, which you'll immediately recognise as that scary church music that's not Toccata and Fugue in D minor, it has this fantastic, heart-poundingly energetic synth score that wouldn't sound out of place on the wildest of giallo. Now, whilst it's hardly a character-driven piece, the cast do a fine job with the script, which, although it's fairly simple once it establishes the premise, keeps things moving along and manages to get us from kill to kill without slowing down too much, whilst also maintaining a decent sense of suspense. It's fairly obvious, given this is an 80s slasher, that the cast are really just there to be offed one by one, but it does a good job with the lead up to the kills, and some of them are quite inventive. And as I say, the shadowy presence of the witch is really what makes this movie stand out from the usual stalk and slash fodder of the period. Sadly, it's another movie that's not available to stream, just something that's becoming an all too common theme on this show. But the Blu-ray is available through the usual outlets at a decent price, and I definitely recommend picking it up if you're a fan of slashers. This is a perfect time capsule of that period where slasher characters like Jason and Michael Myers still had the power to scare and hadn't mutated into bobbleheads or appeared on lunchboxes. It's definitely a movie of its time, but in all honesty, I think it's all the better for it. Now, if you don't want to find out how the movie ends, I suggest stop listening now, because we are about to enter the spoiler zone. Oh, I think I scared myself there. So let's have a quick breakdown of some of the kills in the movie. Now keep in mind this isn't a running tally of every death, and is really just a look at the kills that affect the story directly. So the Leahy son, Justin, is one of the first to die. Although he is killed off-screen whilst exploring the basement, his body does show up later, and this is probably one of the reasons why the movie found itself on the Section 3 Video Nasties list. With Justin missing, Melinda, his mother, goes to confront Sturgis. However, before she can find him, she is shocked to find Justin's body instead, dropped and suspended from a door frame. She is then hurled into the kitchen by the witch, and there's this set piece where it is just unbelievable that they actually managed to do this. The poor actor playing Melinda is literally just thrown around the room, from table to floor, no padding, no stunt double. It's incredible to see just how reckless they were back in the 80s. It was a different time, man. David, meanwhile, returns with the crucifix to rescue the Leahys. He attempts to get the girls out of the house, but Cheryl refuses to leave without Justin, and so he sends Anne alone to his car before heading into the house in an attempt to confront the witch. George, who is battling alcoholism, has spent the entire movie being ineffectual and in a deep depression, but when he hears Melinda's screams coming from the kitchen, it appears he is finally going to have his redemption. Except he doesn't. Instead, he just does what everybody else would do. He runs and locks himself in his bedroom. But once within, he finds the body of Melinda, and outside the window we see the silhouette of the witch, and as George turns away from her, a mirror explodes in his face, showering him with shards of glass and killing him. Cheryl, meanwhile, seeing a door to the attic open by itself, assumes for some reason that this is Justin and heads upstairs to rescue him. Of course, the witch is waiting there for her and drives a stake through her skull, pinning her to the floor. David arrives too late and the witch attacks. However, he is able to ward her off with the crucifix, and in the ensuing battle he is hurled downstairs to the ground floor. He runs from the house to check on Anne, only to discover that she is dead in his vehicle. David realizes that the only way to stop the witch is by burning her, and so he pours gasoline into the lake and then lights it. And as he does so, Mary, the mysterious girl from earlier, appears by his side. He comforts her by saying he's killed the witch, to which she replies, "Well, it would have worked if she'd been home." and at this point he just plunges the crucifix into her heart. Okay, so she is the witch, somehow, but he doesn't know this at this point, and he just straight up murders this kid. Now luckily his hunch was right, and the body of Mary falls into the lake, erupting in flame. David watches as the flames peak and then die out, and he's won. But as he's walking away, a clawed hand grabs him from the lake and drags him under the water as the credits roll. Now, like I said, the movie is very reminiscent of Friday the 13th, right down to the surprise watery ending. But that's not a bad thing, and I think Superstition has enough of a different flavour to avoid it seeming just like a rip-off. There's enough blood to sell the story without becoming over the top, and although there's little in the way of character development or the exploration of big ideas, you can't really fault it for that, because that's not what it's about. The premise is simple. A supernatural killer stalks people in a house and kills them one by one. And there's nothing wrong with that if it's done with the visual flair and the energy that this movie possesses. The set pieces are inventive, created with impressive practical effects, and are different enough to make each one quite memorable, which is really all you want from a slasher of this period. So do give it a watch if you're a fan of this kind of thing, because it really is one of those movies that manages to rise above its simple premise and budget to deliver a fun, entertaining 90 minutes of supernatural shocks. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode of Real Obscure. To learn more about Real Obscure, to find us on other platforms, or give us feedback, please visit realobscurepod.com. This podcast was created, written, edited, produced, and lit by me, Kevin H. Shaw. Our theme tune, Für Manfred und Siggi, was created using Udio, as was our background theme, The Monster Dub. Content from Superstition is used for educational and commentary purposes under Section 107 of the Copyright Act, Fair Use, and remains the property of the respective copyright holder, presented here for the purposes of critique, commentary, and discussion. No copyright infringement is intended, so please don't sue us.